So this is the third panel of the second day of ECR Day 2022, and I'm really excited. I feel like I have a panel of academic celebrities lined up for you, experts in all things public engagement. This is being chaired by Susie, and she's wonderful. And if you want to tweet about today, please do, and use the hashtag ECR Day 2022. And if you're tweeting a picture of someone or their slides, please make sure to cite them and tag them appropriately. We will run in the panel listed on the programme. So we'll start with Fariha, then we'll have Caroline, and then we'll have Morris. We'll have questions at the end. Please use the Q&A box for your questions, not the chat function, because if you use the chat function, then the question might get lost. But you can send through your questions at any point during the presentations. If you think of something and don't want to forget it, you can just put it straight in. And that is all from me. So I'm actually just going to go on ahead and introduce Susie now. So Susie is a PhD candidate here at Queen's in history, and she previously studied at Trinity College Dublin and Oxford. Her PhD is funded by the Department for the Economy, comparatively examines the impact of gender on political imprisonment during the Second World War. She is postgraduate representative on the Executive Committee of the Women's History Association of Ireland. So I will pass over to Susie now and hide myself.
Thanks so much, Alison. Really excited for this panel, actually, excited to learn more. This panel is entitled Writing for Diverse Audiences, Impact and Engaged Research. And our first speaker, Dr. Faria Sheikh, is going to speak to us about working with the media. So Faria is an associate professor of Victorian literature at the University of Birmingham, and her research interests are in 19th century empire and its legacies. And her monograph, 19th Century Settler Emigration in British Literature and Art, was recently published by Edinburgh University Press. And her current project takes forward her interest in imperial modes of circulation to provide a re-examination of opium in the 19th century literary imagination. She's appeared on BBC One, BBC Two, Channel 4, Radio 3, and in many podcasts and at festivals, talking about her own research and about the 19th century more broadly. And she is currently an AHRC BBC Radio 3 New Generation Thinker. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you to Alison for inviting me back for ECR Day 2022. It was a true joy to be part of this day back in 2021, and it's a wonderful initiative on Alison's part to bring together the ECR community and give them a space for building on their career experience, networks and collaborations, as well as demystifying some of the processes of academia. So I'm absolutely delighted to be here. So today, as Susie said, I'll be talking a little bit about my experiences of working with the media. So I'll begin with an overview of what I've done so far, before moving on to describe in a little bit more detail the experiences of working across a range of different media formats, as well as kind of broaching some of the pleasures and challenges of doing so. So hopefully this works. Yes, it works. Okay. So what does my experience to date look like? So far, my experience of doing media work has mainly been in television and radio. And the first time that I was asked to be on television was 2 years ago. Oh, well, 3 years ago now. In 2019. So this was in terms of where I was in my career trajectory. I joined Birmingham in 2017, so it was 2 years into a full-time permanent post. And it was the year 2019 was the year that everyone was celebrating 400 years of the novel. So since Robinson Crusoe came out. And the BBC were doing a 3-part docuseries called Novels That Shaped Our World. And I was invited to appear on 2 episodes on empire and class. So, and I think the third one was on women, but I was in 2 out of 3 of them. And this invitation came a little bit out of the blue. It was an email that just landed in my inbox one day. asking me what I knew about Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre, Kipling's Kim, and Lisbeth Gaskell's, I think it was North and South, or no, Mary Barton. And I took it up at the time. The prospect was an attractive one because it was an invitation to share expertise that had been gained over the last decade since I trained as a 19th centuryist when I started my PhD, as opposed to talking about something more personal and closer to home. So I saw it as an opportunity to share a broader knowledge, my broader knowledge of the 19th century, as opposed to kind of a very specific niche research area. And if I'm perfectly honest, on a very shallow level, I'd never been on TV. I wanted to know what being on TV felt like. In short, the answer was terrifying, but more on that later. So having done that, I was then invited back by the same media company who were producing for Channel 4 this time. So it was IWC Media that produced kind of both the BBC 2 documentary and the Channel 4 documentary. And this was an episode on Britain's most historic towns, on Manchester. And the researcher on that media company wanted to pick my brains further about Lisbeth Gaskell, who she'd already interviewed me for Novels That Shaped the World, and kind of what industrial Manchester looked like in the 19th century. So that's an example of kind of how one thing leads to another and collaborations kind of extend across different projects. My most recent experience of working in TV has been the 8-part series that just recently dropped on BBC One as a series drop a couple of weeks ago. And this was Art That Made Us. And it looks at the history of Britain through art over the last 1,000 years or so. So that's kind of my experience in working in television. My work in radio has mainly been through the New Generation Thinkers scheme. So I was part of the New Generation Thinkers scheme last year. And the first 3 that you see there, so the Free Thinking New Generation Thinkers 2021, the postcard, which is a 3 to 4 minute kind of foray into what my research on migration is about, appears in the episode on displacement. And then my essay, which is the 14 minutes kind of me solo talking, came out actually yesterday, called Opium Tales. Those 3 things are part of the kind of the guaranteed bits, if you like, of the New Generation Thinkers scheme. So if you get onto the scheme, kind of those are the 3 things that will come out of the scheme. And they're all different kind of formats. They're all kind of, I guess, graded steps into radio work. And then the last 2, when I appeared in conversation on Radio 3's The Verb Puddings, and then on Radio 4's Pride and Prejudice, wasn't really part of the New Generation Thinker scheme, but I think that the invitations for that came out of the New Generation Thinker scheme in terms of people kind of recommending my name and just kind of the networks that various producers kind of know each other. And again, kind of all of these different, across kind of the 3 television programs, across those 5 radio programs, the format of them within that genre are quite different. And I can talk a little bit more about that if anyone's got questions in the Q&A. So how did I kind of get into doing media work? I think it's difficult to identify any singular moment. I used to think that it was that email that landed in my inbox inviting me to talk about novels that shaped the world that perhaps was a catapult for kind of all of the rest of it. But actually on reflection, I realized that this may have been, like that kind of initial invitation may have been a product of seeking out collaborations elsewhere. So for example, in 2015, when I was a postdoc at UCD, which is where I met Alison, I kind of got in touch with the National Gallery of Ireland and was part of the lecture series, Irish Migration and the Pathos of Distance. And then in 2019, I was a Hay Festival speaker. And both of those things may have been what kind of contributed to just kind of getting my name out there. I don't know, it's always difficult to trace a line of influence. But I was kind of taking steps to kind of get more involved in broader ways of disseminating my research. Other things that I've done, and I'm putting them here partly because they fall under festivals and podcasts, but also because I'm going to refer to them later on in the talk, is that in 2020, I appeared in one of the episodes of the Departures podcasts that the Migration Museum had put together to accompany their exhibition called Departures. And in 2021, kind of that led on to another collaboration with the Migration Museum and a artist to hold a workshop at the museum as part of the Being Human Festival. So I just kind of want to flag those up because I'll be referring back to them a little bit later. So kind of in terms of thinking about what are the proactive steps that you can do to get into more media, get into media more broadly, I think there are a number of different things. Some of it might be chance and luck, so kind of getting that initial invitation. But I think it's also important to stress that there is no one route, and there are kind of proactive steps that you might take to think about curating your kind of own experience or journey or kind of profile in a way that positions you, I won't say kind of gets you the role that you want, but I will say kind of positions you in a better position to enable that. So, and kind of one more thing to say about that initial invitation is that kind of that's quite useful to have that and then kind of build from there. That's kind of what I tried to indicate in the previous few slides. But it's also worth bearing in mind that this generally tends to happen if you're being asked to speak about more canonical material and authors. So if you do work with more marginal authors, I do, and I'm sure kind of there are many in the audience who do as well, but there has to be a way of shaping the narrative if you're pitching so that there is a hook for public appeal or audience. So kind of there is that kind of tension between repeating kind of what you think, what the audience kind of already know, what is kind of already mainstream, and kind of the extent to which you feel that should be challenged. Seeking out collaborations with cultural institutions is also a way of building up contacts and experience. So as I said, the Migration Museum podcast that I was part of was to accompany their exhibition Departures that was exploring 400 years of emigration from Britain. And the public lecture at the National Gallery of Ireland was again around an exhibition on Irish famine migration, kind of specifically. So it's worth keeping an eye out on what's happening and identifying whether or not there is a natural fit with your research in line with other cultural events that are happening. That can often be quite a good way of just getting your foot in the door. And even if nothing happens, it's good to kind of reach out to people, find out what's going on, and then kind of at least they know you and they kind of can bear you in mind for if anything else does come up. Building a profile by writing for public-facing platforms. And now I know that there are people in the room who will be able to speak to this much better than me, Alison being one of them. But writing for places like The Conversation or the History Workshop Journal can be a good way of getting your name and your work and your expertise out there for people who are seeking potential speakers. And I've got kind of friends and colleagues who have done that. And as a result of their work kind of having appeared on these public platforms, other people having gotten in touch with them and kind of saying that that is how they kind of came to know of their work and of them. So kind of having something out there in written format is quite a good way of doing that. And last but not least, using social media platforms to build collaborations with journalists or researchers for production companies is a good way of making sure that people kind of know or remember you, and advertising kind of in your profile or your bio kind of tag words or keywords for what your research involves can be a good way of just kind of flagging up to people who are kind of scouting out potential speakers. So I think kind of the most important thing is, in terms of getting into media, while there is an element of luck or chance involved, there are also positive steps, proactive steps that you can take in order to skew events in your favor. In terms of what it's like to work with media, this is like a really broad question, and I've got a very little amount of time to kind of condense everything into. But it depends on kind of what kind of route things have taken. So is it a case where producers have a set idea of what they want, they've invited you, they have a very clear direction of what they want the episode to look like? Or have you actually pitched ideas to the producer? And the two are kind of very different kettles of fish. They're very different kind of scenarios. And over the next few slides, I'll go over this in a little bit more detail. So if it's the case where you've been invited, usually what will happen, or what has happened with me, is that there's an initial kind of email to set up a phone consultation. And then the initial phone consultation, which can last anything from 30 minutes to an hour, is to scope out if your expertise fits with what the producers have in mind. If you do get this email, this kind of phone conversation, be prepared to be grilled. Like, they will mine you for kind of everything that you know, because I think it also depends on kind of the stage at which they are in producing the program. So it's in their interests to kind of know as much as possible about what you know and kind of where they can fit that into the shape of the program overall. But it can be quite a lengthy, intensive discussion. And then if that goes well and you kind of both decide that it's a fit, then there'll usually be an invitation to come back and record or present. That, I mean, I've put a day there. I've put a day there thinking about the various, if that includes travel, usually that's for kind of TV work more than for radio work. So kind of, it can take a considerable chunk out of your working week. For radio, depending on whether or not you need to travel, that can also take a considerable chunk out of your working week, but it is possible to do it remotely as well. So it's worth scoping out the amount of time that it will take, not just to record, but also to kind of what their expectations are in terms of travel and accommodation. And this goes back, the next point goes back to what I was saying earlier about depending on the format of the event. The recording can either take the form of a series of takes. So if you're doing it for television, that's what happened in Channel 4's Britain's Most Historic Towns. So it was doing take after take after take. Or it can be a more informal interview style where you get asked a question off camera and then you're expected to kind of answer at length. And examples of that are novels that shaped our world and art that made us. Or it could be a conversation with other panelists. And it's not a free-for-all, the conversation. You will be briefed beforehand on when and what to say. And that's an example of that is kind of the Verb puddings, where I was with 5 or 6 other people. And it was kind of produced as a very informal, kind of chatty conversation, even though a lot of work had gone on behind the scenes to kind of make it appear so. So lots of different kind of formats that the event could take. Where you pitch, this is where you have your own idea, you've come across something really interesting or exciting in your research, and you think, no, I don't want to talk about stuff more generally, I want to talk about kind of my research specifically. This is sometimes easier if you have a pre-existing relationship, although it's not impossible. And depending on kind of what the format is and kind of who you're pitching to, a pitch can be something as simple as a couple of lines. So it's worth finding out kind of, if you do want to pitch something, what people's expectations are and how much work they expect you to put in to a pitch. And unlike kind of the scenario where you're invited, usually a pitch is drawn from your own research or interests. And you might have to pitch a number of times or to a number of people or companies before becoming successful. So it's kind of more exciting because it's drawn from your own research, perhaps more exciting. I don't know, it depends on kind of what floats your boat. But it is a very different experience, I think. So what's the benefit of working with media? Well, it provides a different outlet for your research and expertise. It's a way of reframing and re-narrativizing your expertise for a public audience, which leads to greater dissemination beyond the boundaries of an academic conference or an academic kind of piece of writing. I also think it's useful to think about it not just kind of as a process of a one-way dissemination, but a symbiotic relationship. So building connections, using the experience to build connections with media companies, with producers, with researchers that are working outside of academia. And then that can be quite a fruitful way of kind of finding ways of working those relationships and networks back into projects, academic projects or collaborations or grant proposals. So thinking about kind of it not just as a one-way kind of street of dissemination, but as a symbiotic relationship that then kind of channels or fuels your own work and your own research in quite productive ways. I think working with media professionals has also given me insight into what I find interesting versus what the public find interesting. And this can be quite different. So I remember on Channel 4, Britain's Most Historic Towns, the producer Tony King kind of interrupting me when I thought I was giving the most fascinating and long-winded answer to a question and saying, Fariha, no one wants this. No one wants this. You've got to think in bullet points. And so kind of distilling all of what you know as kind of into those bullet points, into those kind of key top lines is a challenge sometimes, if I'm honest. Working for radio too, or kind of two as in TOO, not TWO, but working for radio has also made me appreciate how different writing something to be kind of read is to writing something that is kind of oral and to be listened to. So there are much shorter sentences, kind of you're going at a much slower pace to kind of give people the time to kind of absorb what you're saying. They don't have a visual reference for what you're saying. But also I think what's been kind of quite useful working across kind of all of these different media platforms and festivals and podcasts is not assuming what your audience know. And a particular example of that is my essay, Opium Tales, that came out yesterday, where in the first draft of that I kind of dived straight into what I talk about at the end of the essay. And in the redraft, the feedback that I got was, don't assume that your audience know any of this. And so kind of in the redraft, I had to kind of go all the way back to the 19th century to stuff that I thought everybody knew, and the producer kind of assured me that everybody might not. So kind of making those judgment calls and those assumptions about what people know has been quite eye-opening, I think. And then the flip side is what's the less glamorous side of working with media. The first thing that I would say is that it takes an inordinate amount of time, and this time can be kind of due to nerves, due to prep, and due to travel. And the nerves kind of partly for me was because media work is something that I've learned on the job. It's something that I've not been trained in. It's something that I've kind of just gotten better and better at by doing. And the first thing that I definitely did when I did that kind of first episode on novels that shaped our world was I definitely over prepped. I remember, it sounds silly now when I say it, but I remember revising Gaskell, even though I have written about Gaskell and I have taught Gaskell for years. And so the amount of prep and note taking that I did was completely unnecessary. But even without kind of nerves sending me into overdrive, you might be asked to speak about something that is tangentially related to your work, which will require prep and some extra research. So it's a consideration of, do you have time for it? Does this fit into what you already want to do? The travel, as I said, takes time. If you're able to do it, that's all very well and good, but your own personal circumstances might not allow you to take the time out to do so. And it's worth kind of checking with media companies. If you know that you're in a position where you might not be able to travel, it's worth checking with media companies before that 1 hour consultation over the phone, what their expectations are, so that you're not kind of giving over your time without kind of getting something from it, as it were. The second thing to bear in mind is kind of the editing process. So that is largely out of your control. Well, that is out of your control. You're not kind of, you don't have any say over kind of what goes in and what kind of doesn't go in. So for example, Novels That Shape the World interviewed me for Jane Eyre, in addition to Mary Barton and Kim. But in the final edit, they made this really weird decision to kind of only have Black and Caribbean critics for Jane Eyre, given the novel's location, and only South Asian critics for Kipling's Kim. So that was kind of something that was outside of my control. I'd given up the time to do that, and I just had to take that on the chin. And then the last thing is the money question. So the question about money is very interesting because nobody hardly ever brings it up. It's on you, excuse the grammatical error on the slide. But people hardly ever bring it up in their kind of, and they kind of will wait for you to bring it up. So it is on you to bring it up. And I would say when I first started, this kind of used to really get me every single time. But now I'm quite upfront about it because it kind of really gets me that people don't bring it up, because you are the expert. And so you shouldn't be selling yourself and your expertise short. Like, you have spent years investing in kind of knowing a particular period, knowing a particular author, and that has clout. So own that clout. So always ask if you're going to be compensated for your time. So do you have budget to pay for speakers? If you feel like you want to kind of set your rate, say that my rate is XYZ, would you be able to meet this? And I would also say factor in prep and travel time into rates and make it clear that you're doing so. So if kind of traveling to Salford or Manchester or London is going to take an entire day, depending on where you are, say that kind of this will be a day's worth of work and set your rate accordingly. Find out about accommodation. Usually they will pay, but it's worth kind of finding that out and making sure that you're not paying for your own accommodation. I'm not going to say don't ever work for free, because there have been instances where I have worked for free, but they have been instances where I've made those kind of, I've thought about it and I've made those careful kind of judgments. So for example, the Migration Museum podcast I did for free, but I knew that I was going to do that for free because I was talking basically about my book. And so for me, I saw that as part of kind of portfolio building or exposure for my own book. And it didn't really require any extra work on my part. It was basically free promotion for my book. And it was also a way of me to, I'd been trying to work with the Migration Museum for years by that point. So it was a way of me kind of making that collaboration and making that kind of network or relationship work for me. So I didn't take kind of money for that, but that was a judgment call on my part, as opposed to kind of people not bringing it up and me being too coy about bringing it up. Finally, be prepared to push back. So I've had instances where I've kind of asked, do you have budget? Kind of what's your rate? How much are you paying speakers? And people being on the face of it quite surprised that I'm asking. But I think stand your ground, because there is always budget and you should always be paid for your time and your money and your expertise. And so that you're not kind of undercutting freelancers. And I think that is my last slide. So thank you very much for listening. And I'm really looking forward to the rest of the panel and to hearing your questions at the end.
Thank you so much. Fascinating insights and really, really useful. I'm sure we'll have lots to talk about in the Q&A. Our next speaker is Dr. Caroline McGuinness. And Caroline is an academic and writer who is originally from Portsdown here in Northern Ireland, and she's a reader in 20th and 21st century literature and the impact lead for the School of Art and Media at the University of Salford. She's also the author of numerous articles, essays and chapters on contemporary Northern Irish literature and culture, and published Northern Irish Writing After the Troubles with Bloomsbury Academic last year, and is currently writing a literary history of the childless woman. Thanks, Caroline.
Okay, so thank you very much to Alison, to all of her colleagues at Queen's in Belfast, Ramona Ray, Susie, just everyone that's been here today has really put on the most phenomenal, astounding programme. So thank you very much for having me. So what I'm going to talk about today, some of what I might talk about today might be more relevant for those of you who either are currently working within the sort of the British academic system or are interested to find out a bit more about that. But hopefully some of what I want to say about impact will extend and develop among those of you who are also developing public engagement projects more generally. So I'll talk like a little bit about myself, but I won't talk too much about what I've done. First of all, I am a different generation to most of you that are here today in terms of the sort of the career stage that I'm at, and I won't presume to sort of extrapolate the things that I have had access to with my sort of with the job security that I have. So we'll talk a little bit about that, but I'll not talk too much about that today. So I originally have a PhD in Northern Irish literature from Queen's University in Belfast. I worked in various different hourly paid and precarious jobs for about 5 or 6 years before eventually becoming a lecturer at the University of Salford, and then getting promoted to reader a couple of years ago. Now, one of the things that I maybe do want to talk about is that I am not really what you might consider a very sort of strategic career planning sort of a person. I mostly do things that I think are important, and then sort of try to work it into a grand narrative later on for, you know, various different purposes. I am really interested in sort of giving voice to people who have been left out of sort of dominant accounts of the Troubles. Now, what I'm hopefully going to talk about today is how I managed to make some of that very diverse array of activity sort of retrofitted into making it seem more coherent than it was at the time. Especially for those of you who work on Irish literature, Northern Irish culture, anything, or any sort of area of research or expertise, which is maybe a bit different to what's being taught in your institution. You'll start to be looked at in certain ways when people start to think about impact case studies, because your work seems to think that it might speak to the needs of different communities. So for me, I sort of fell into a lot of this work. So I became a member and later chair of the British Association for Irish Studies. I've done some work with the Irish World Heritage Centre, with the New Irish Consulate in Manchester. The coolest picture of me that ever exists is this picture from the Repeal the 8th event as part of the Manchester Literary Festival. I've been involved with open access initiatives such as the Open Library of the Humanities. I've hosted events on the 20th anniversary of the Manchester bomb and then the 20th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement. So all of these things were sort of things that I did because I thought they were important. So I think before I start to get on to what might sound today like a bit of a sort of neoliberal corporate shill pitch for how you make these things valuable in institutions, I want to just begin by saying I got into this work because I thought it was important. And I also thought, in particular, talking about Irishness in England, I thought was a really important thing to do. So I got into this for a reason, and then I made it work for me. So hopefully something I say will be useful and I won't get subtweeted all over the internet, but we'll see what happens. So the work that I've done then has mostly been about trying to communicate with people, because I think that the understanding of Irishness and the understanding of the history of the Troubles, especially sort of among the corridors of power, can be something that can be quite lacking. So I really wanted, and I thought there was a reason to do this work. And then a few years ago, I got approached about potentially turning this work into what's called an impact case study. Now, today is what you might call, what I'm calling, and it's not really catching on, Refmas Eve, or the few days before universities, and then sort of the wider community, and get a look at the ref results next week. So the other thing about Impact is that first, the rule of Impact Club is that no one talks about Impact Club. So Impact happens and no one really sort of talks about it on social media or anywhere else, that's what they're doing, and that's some of what they're really interested in. So what I want to think then about is, how do you take this work, and how do you take stuff that you want to do, that you think is important, and how do you translate that into the sort of outputs? And I'll use some of that language that might be valuable to your career. So basically, how can you do what you want to do anyway, and use that to get bits of funding from your institution, and then have that work be valued in a greater sense? I see there's some stuff in the chat. Hopefully it's not me. Oh yes, yeah. Okay, good. That's just people thanking for you, who was brilliant. So that's fantastic. Okay, I hope there wasn't. We can't hear you, but here we are. So I'll talk to you then about what impact is, and how it works and how it functions. So impact work is a kind of work that is valued within institutions, and it's valued for a number of different reasons. The first way that impact work is valued is as part of what's called a ref environment report. So with the submission that we have to do every 5 or 6 years, you submit this document that talks about all of the different bits and bobs of research that go on inside the institution. And that might include external partnerships, networks, so that return in itself is scored. So if you have that sort of work, you work with local community organizations, you work with these things, it just adds texture and deepens your institution's environment report, like I said, which is also scored. It's also valued in terms of the knowledge exchange framework, which is a more sort of metrics-driven way of understanding the impact agenda, but it's something that I've only been impact lead for a month, so I'm trying to get a handle on the knowledge exchange framework at the moment. The way that quite often public engagement is valued and can be through a formal impact case study, and that's some of what I'll sort of set up and talk about today. Public engagement is also valued often, and I'm sure this is something that many of our other speakers today, especially Alison, know a lot more about, but as tangible outcomes for funding proposals. And that can also be for PhD funding proposals, for funding from associations, like we've just recently awarded bursaries from the British Association for Irish Studies as well. The other way that this work is sometimes valued can be for promotions. I know it was a major factor in me getting promoted. It can also be a major factor in business case applications to either bump someone up from being, sort of a teaching fellow to a lecturer, or to keep someone on who is on a fixed term contract. So I'm not saying that you have to do all of the things that I'm talking about today. What I'm saying is it is a kind of work that, if measured correctly, is something that institutions valued. Should it be? Should it not be? I'll let you sort of debate the ethical considerations of this, the fact that not everyone wants to or is well suited to doing public engagement work. I'm just telling you the facts, that it is a kind of work that is often valued by institutions. And that's what I hopefully want to talk about today. So what is an impact case study? So this is something that I unfortunately have to think about rather a lot. So for within these submissions that are made to the Research Excellence Framework, an individual researcher or a team of researchers is submitted for one of these impact case studies. Now, not everyone in a department has to do one of these, but a few people in each department have to do them. Now, the way in which that work is thought of can be quite varied across different kinds of institutions. Now, different kinds of institutions have more resources to support this work than others. Many people who do impact case studies, the work that they do, and it is work, is often supported by people who have HRC grants, British Academy grants. You'll often see a lot of public engagement built into these big funded grants, and then you'll look online on Twitter and you'll think, oh, you're planning a lot of public engagement, that must be an impact case study. We're very early in the next cycle. So with the results coming out next week, we're very early for thinking about planning. So most institutions are in a sort of a feeling at the moment that they are looking around to try to see who might eventually have capacity for an impact case study. Now, you would not be expected to bring this with you to a job application. You wouldn't be expected to be, here's a case study, here is the final product, but to show willing and to show that you understand this, that this is important to institutions, but also that you might be able to do something in the future. So it might be enough to say that I have built impact and public engagement into my PhD. I have done X, Y, and Z public engagement events, and to be able to show that this is something that you will build up to perhaps in the future. So there are all sorts of what's called impact capture, and I'm really sorry, I'm going to be talking about like outputs and impact capture as if these weren't sort of terms for things that are, people and, like research that we care about. So there are different kinds of the ways that we measure impact. That might be testimonials. Now, you might want to think about who, and to use this language, who are the stakeholders of your research? So who are the people and communities who might be interested in the kind of research that you do? Is it, in my case, the Irish community and also the public at large who maybe want to know more about Ireland and Irish identity? You might sort of get key quotes from some of those stakeholders about how now this is, I'm going to talk about all the gross bits of impact in a second, and getting quotes and getting testimonials is the grossest part of it all. You might take note of your independent citations in the media. So if people talk about your work in the media, so this is where I maybe want you, if you're doing public engagement, to get into the way of record keeping and keeping notes of all the things that you're doing, so that if you have to build a case study, now, you might not necessarily think that you're building towards a case study, and then you might be in a department where a couple of people might leave in the middle of the cycle, and all of a sudden people are going, oh, but doesn't she do a lot of public engagement? We could maybe get a case study out of her. So what I'm suggesting that you do is think about record keeping and think about building all of these things. So you're not like Googling your own name to find everything if it comes to it. Now, this is less of a case for arts and humanities, but maybe for those of you who are working in public policy. If your research has led to a documented change in codes or guidance, that might be something else that might sort of work for you as well. And also, and I'll talk about surveys in a second, this was to me the most challenging part of it all, which was, oh, so it's not enough to give the talk, you have to have feedback from the talk. And I know we live in an audit culture and all we do is get feedback, but I think it is really helpful in this case. You might think of sort of things like business performance measures and these sorts of things. You might think they're more relevant to maybe, sort of other subject areas, but equally you might find that you have increased awareness and sales of a novel. You might find that you have increased tourism in a particular exhibition. So there are ways in which you can actually measure how your work is having an actual impact. Now, for a good impact case study, the first thing it has to have is it has to be based on the research that you've done. So you have to have, and it was 6 at the last, and you have to have 6 sort of outputs, and they can be books, journal articles, chapters, things like that. And they have to be a good enough standard to be ref that say specific things. Now, if you're, this is why it gets easier if you're doing it as a group. So I did like a solo project. So it was, it was like, okay, I've written 6 things, so it was fine. But often if a project team is working together on a big project, that can be really helpful for co-authored publications. So you basically have to say, these articles said this, they made this change. I translated this change into this activity made this change. That's what's called the impact chain. The thing you say, how you broadcast that, what changes. And I'll talk a little bit about that change in a second. Most of them will have testimonials. This was the most embarrassing part of the whole thing, which was me having to write to, you'll see it when my case study comes out next week, having to write to journalists that I'd worked with, having to write to novelists that I had worked with, to basically ask them to write a nice wee letter saying I was brilliant. And that absolutely mortified me. So just to let you know, it's all about building up evidence and pictures of evidence. So whether that's questionnaires, whether that's social media metrics, which is something else that I used in mine, all of this that you can use. So on mine, I tried to look at the way in which people had responded to a Twitter threads that I did about Northern Irish fiction. So I did this by counting views. I did this by counting people who replied to me. I did this by capturing people who said, oh, I'll go off and read that. That's horrifically cynical, right? But it did the job, you know what I mean? So all of the ways in which you build up a picture, you prove not just that you're doing the thing, but that people are responding to the thing as well. So it's more than just, I say just public engagement, as if public engagement isn't something that's really important, but it's more than just doing public engagement. It's an effect on a change or a benefit. There's lots of different things that can benefit, but it's a benefit beyond academia. And it has to be really clearly that something has changed. So it's not enough just to say, I'm getting my work out there. Like that's great. And I think you should do that. And that is valuable for your environment report, for things like that. It's this bit here that is really tricky, but if you get it right, it brings in money to your department. An impact case study is you become a very valuable member of staff if you have an impact case study. So I'm not suggesting you have to do this yet. God, my impact case study, it took me being in a permanent job for 5 years before I even thought about going near an impact case study. And also I had to quickly pivot an impact case study that had funding attached to it, that had public events for the last 2 years of the pandemic. So that's why mine might rely quite heavily on social media as well whenever it comes out as well. So I'm not suggesting you should do this, but you might do it and you might be all right. So that's just what I'm saying. If you're prepared to do some of this work, the first thing I would do, and I'm not sure if my wee head is over some of these slides, but I'll read them out anyway. The first thing you might do is, if your institution provides media training, take it. My media training in Salford is the best bit of training I've had at any institution, and I've been in academia for nearly 20 years, right? It's amazing. So shout out to the Media Factory and Caroline Cheatham at Salford, where I did a radio interview. I did a sit down on the couch like I was on the rain. I did a media interview with a former quite right-wing newspaper tabloid journalist who sat down and tried to catch me out as if she was going to do a gotcha. And that was amazing. And most institutions have some form of that. And quite often they have capacity for early career researchers to take that as well. So it's available, take it. The other thing you might want to do if you're in a department is ask people how they got on with their case studies, and ask them, you know, what they did, what were their outputs, because it'll be different in different fields. Like an English lit one is different to a history one, is different from a media one. So there's lots of different ways to do these case studies. Save, if you have nice tweets about your work, save them somewhere. And I know you might, this is all cringe, but you might want to save them somewhere just so you can kind of build up that picture and eventually how your work has been used. When you're doing your first public events, if you're doing public events, ask people for feedback. Don't be ashamed, don't be afraid of it. Start to find out where the hooks of your work are. As Freya said brilliantly, start to find out the things that people are actually interested in rather than things that you're interested in. And you might want to ask a friend or a family member. Like I talk to my mum a lot, I talk to my partner a lot, I talk to my non-academic friends, I say there's some non-academic friends. So I talk to a lot of people about how that is all working. So I'm maybe not going to talk maybe a lot about the perils of public engagement, because not that I don't want to scare you, but also you all know what the internet is like. You all know, and I know Maurice might talk a little bit about this as well. I have found it to be not only mixed, but also something that I have to think about myself and sort of protecting myself alongside doing some of this work as well. I have found, for example, if you write for the conversation and anyone writes under your article, which people often do, it will email you all of the comment section. So turn that off if you ever write for the conversation. You might have people, especially if you are either a young woman or from a minoritized community, you may well have people who will question your authority in public. You may well be, your work may be responded to in ways that are quite difficult, especially online. So I'm not saying that the public engagement garden is everything's rosy there, but it is a kind of work which is practically and materially valued within institutions. And I'm really sorry if all of that sounded a bit cynical today, but finding ways to speak to this agenda has allowed me to do the kinds of work that I want to do. It's allowed me to go out and talk to people about the complexities of culture in the north of Ireland. It's allowed me to do loads of different kinds of public engagement. It's allowed me to write for newspapers and do work for the BBC. It's allowed me to do all these things that I wanted to do anyway. So you don't have to do this, but if you want to do it anyway, it's always good to know what you're at. All right, so that's me, and I'm more than happy to take any of your questions afterwards with the panel, of course. But if you want to sort of at me on Twitter, that's absolutely fine too. But if you are you're sort of coming from a non-traditional academic background, which I do, or any sort of or you're at an institution where you're maybe sort of feeling a bit adrift, just send me an email, and I'm more than happy to have a chat with you about your potential for impact. All right, thanks very much.
Another incredibly generous offer there, and really useful advice and insights. Our last speaker of today's panel is Dr. Maurice Casey, who was also here at Queen's, and he's speaking to us about engaged research and working with the public. So Maurice is a research fellow at Queen's, working on the project Queer Northern Ireland, Sexuality Before Liberation. He was awarded his DPhil in history from the University of Oxford in 2020, and he specialises in radical history, transnational history and queer history, and is interested in how each of these can transform popular understandings of Ireland and its diaspora in the 20th century. And his public history experience has included curating 2 exhibitions as the historian in residence at EPIC, the Irish Emigration Museum, alongside numerous contributions to radio, podcasts and television. And Maurice is currently working on a trade audience history book, which is provisionally titled Hotel Lux, An Intimate History of World Revolution. So thanks, Maurice.
Great. Thank you. Can you all hear me okay? Yeah?
Yeah, perfect.
Great. So firstly, thanks, Susie, and thanks, Alison, and thank you to everyone who's been working behind the scenes as well to bring this event together. So Caroline referenced the public engagement garden, so I'm very sorry that I'm going to drag us all into the public engagement swamp where the trolls live, but really what I want to focus on is Twitter. And I began thinking about speaking about Twitter at this event before Elon Musk purchased the website. But since that has happened, this question of does academia have a future on Twitter, I think has become much more important. So really what I've kind of provisionally titled my talk is how to be good at Twitter and why being good at Twitter is bad for you. What I would prefer to be talking about, of course, is what it means to be a public scholar in an era of grave historical importance with intertwining crises of climate, pandemic and war, but I'm going to be talking about Twitter. And although that might sound flippant, the overarching theme of what I'm about to say is that how we as a profession have been distracted from contributing something meaningful through instead spending time on Twitter. It's also kind of a personal story too, because I think if I'm going to talk about my journey through my career as a public historian, then I need to speak about where much of it took place. Twitter has been the origin point for many, if not most, of the engagement opportunities I have had in both traditional academia and broadcast media. But if Twitter does provide us with opportunities, that is only secondary to its ultimate goal of monetizing us and our work for the benefit of Silicon Valley executives. Twitter, again, has absolutely had a positive influence on my career. My Twitter profile has come up in every cover letter and interview that I've done so far. And as both Caroline and Free have shown, there are real benefits to having a Twitter profile and having a prominent Twitter profile, and I'm not here to deny that. But I am cautious about recommending colleagues to join the platform, and I'm deeply unhappy with the idea that another generation of ECRs should have to rely on it. The good news is I believe we can have all of the benefits without the negatives. We just have to make a series of active decisions, some hard and some easy. And I'm not going to argue against sharing your research online, far from it, Those who scoff at online public engagement and would rather academics speak only among themselves have long since lost the argument. And while they dwindle into irrelevance, however, influence on our work and lives. Our profession's collective failure to imagine an alternative public sphere to Twitter is, I believe, funneling public-facing ECRs onto a platform that raises pressing questions about the ethics of engagement and impact, not only surrounding the anxiety-inducing and addictive features of the platform itself, but crucial questions about who benefits from what we share and, as Caroline has suggested, what it means to rely on a virtual workspace where harassment is rife. I genuinely believe that commercial social media is not a viable option for academic public engagement long term, and that is ultimately a very good thing. Choosing alternatives to Twitter will make us more engaged, a more thoughtful community of scholars, a community that enriches each other, the public, and does not enrich Elon Musk. So, to start with my personal history, I started my Twitter account in 2011, only really began investing time into it in 2015. Late 2019 was when I was most active on Twitter. That was when I was seeing the most increase in my followers. And it was also, and not incidentally, the final months of my PhD, and I was going to Twitter for distraction. And I was tweeting regularly, and I also felt that because my tweets were rewarded by this endorphin hit of notifications and followers and opportunities, I felt that this tweeting was productive. It took me a while to see how my offline self was changing as a result, and I was, admittedly quite an excessive Twitter user. I was distracted and irritable, I was more argumentative, I was less generous with friends and family, and I was also more anxious, and that was partly, of course, because of the looming PhD deadline. And what also took up so much of my time was not just watching the notifications tab, but my problem was that I spent so much time crafting tweets themselves because of this thing that social media scholars call context collapse. Twitter is a limitless and contextless audience, so I was analysing every tweet I was putting out from a number of angles. How will my colleagues interpret it? How will my friends interpret it? How will this was just something that I began to realize was taking up so much of my time, but also I began to think more critically about how I was interpreting the world almost through the news feed, and how its constant and unending scroll made me feel as though I had a kind of a moral obligation to share my thoughts. Social media companies place vast resources into making timelines as addictive as possible, precisely by fostering that idea that we simply must share. Consuming news on Twitter through short and often impassioned personalized responses rather than fact-checked and analytical articles made me feel connected to events to an unhealthy degree. As Julia Bell states, the atomization of reality brought about by newsfeed algorithms forces us to pay attention to how people feel about events rather than what they think about ideas. At the end of 2019, I realized that I needed to reorientate myself. To begin with, I had to confront this framework through which I'd largely understood my reality. I needed to take a real cold hard look at my Twitter usage. And this book, which I have here, Jenny Odell's book, How to Do Nothing, Resisting the Attention Economy, was really pivotal in sort of changing my thoughts around this. And in the book, she writes about how corporate platforms buy and sell our attention, how they cultivate a narrow definition of productivity and foster a cult of individuality and personal branding that affects the way we think about the real existing world. Odell, in her book, acutely diagnoses the effects of current social media on expression, including the right not to express oneself and its deliberately addictive features. The villain, notes Odell, is not the internet nor social media, but the invasive logic of commercial social media and its financial incentive to keep us in a profitable state of anxiety, envy, and distraction. Reading Odell's book, I realized something that upended my relationship with Twitter as an academic. I realized that I was not a user of the platform was using me. I was providing my labor free of charge, so the adverts could sit alongside my work. I willingly told the machine my precise desires, and then the machine, of course, fed adverts back to me. The goal of the website, I realized, was not to provide a democratic space for discussion. The goal of the website was simply to make a profit for the people who owned it. And I became ever more attached to a right I didn't realize until I read Odell's book, that right not to express myself, and certainly not to express myself in a way that adds to the already unimaginable wealth of corporations. As Julia Bell sums it up concisely, our thoughts and fears are manipulated and distorted by the platforms because a system predicated on the acquisition of money above all else does not care about the truth, only what sells. The bitter arguments that thrived amongst my colleagues on the platform, I realized, were not simply the products of academic debate, but structured within a business model that relied on provoking emotional investment. Anxious and outraged people spend more time looking at a screen, so they see more ads. The anxiety I felt after time spent on Twitter was not a glitch. I began to realize it was part of the design. So I was good at Twitter in the eyes of colleagues, hiring panels, and friends, but most crucially, in the eyes of the corporation. I generated free content directed at large audiences, and adverts that I didn't profit from were tagged to the research I produced and which the taxpayer had funded. I thought I was making my research public, but rather I was funneling it through a private company that paid me nothing. I couldn't get back the hours of free labour I provided to Twitter, but I could willfully become bad at the unpaid job I had accidentally turned into a side career. So back in 2019, here's some steps that I took to have a more healthy relationship with the platform, which if you're in a similar situation to like I was and still am to some degree, they might be useful for you too. The first thing I did was set up a Word document, and whenever I felt the urge to tweet a hot take or make some historical controversial point, I would type the tweet into this document instead. Then at the end of the day, I would read through the tweets I drafted, realize the anxiety I'd avoided by not tweeting them, and then I just delete the document. I begin and still try to avoid Twitter before noon, and because I realized that logging in first thing in the morning had impacted the structure of my thinking, and it was ruining my ability to focus and making my thoughts erratic. An important thing for ECRs, particularly around this issue of this idea of public engagement in the media, is that I stopped doing Twitter threads after I realized that every good Twitter thread is a public-facing publication wasted. Instead of investing time into the perfect historical thread to go viral, I write up a pitch and send it to a newspaper or magazine. Sure, the research may get a smaller audience than a thread that can be seen by hundreds of thousands, but I get a line on my CV and I also get paid. And there's also, of course, as many of my colleagues, Alison included, have modelled, you can do a thread after you've published something, and that way you're getting both benefits. But perhaps most importantly is to come back to that perspective change that I did, from going to seeing myself as a user of the platform to seeing myself as an unpaid employee of Twitter.com. In doing so, I realized that if this website was really about promoting products from which I didn't profit, then I should do my best to ensure that my tweets fit into two categories: self-promotion and the promotion of people I like, my friends and colleagues. Nothing more. And my final rule is this: my Twitter account is designed to self-destruct. When I have found a place of security in my career and a sustainable means of regularly sharing my research with the public, crucially, my reward to myself will be the deletion of my account. And why I don't yet advocate deleting your account, though some might disagree with me, is because, unfortunately, commercial social media is where we now meet our audience. And I would not feel comfortable telling ECRs to forego a public engagement platform that genuinely has facilitated amazing opportunities for me, even though I now see it as one with diminishing returns. But so it can be important to realize when you've got to that point too, when it's taking far much more from you than you're giving to it. And while I don't want to suggest we return to some idealized vision of the 19th century German seminar, I do want to make the case that excessive Twitter usage upends our ability to carry out our profession as we should, compassionately, thoughtfully, and diligently. Julia Bell writes of how commercial social media makes us too outraged to actually think, so busy interacting, raging, denouncing, that we are tricked into thinking we are actually changing something, rather than just responding to these manufactured demands on our attention. Add to this, of course, the amount of disinformation being deliberately spread through social media channels by intentionally bad faith actors. And the example I often give is how we wouldn't feel comfortable sitting in a lecture room where everybody was constantly misinterpreting each other, where our papers are periodically interrupted by adverts, and where someone has let a group of neo-Nazis register as attendees. So why do we accept it online? We accept it because what I am ultimately proposing, moving academia off Twitter, right now has enormous downsides. One, as we've learned, it remains an important metric by which people reading funding proposals and book proposals judge the promotional and impact abilities of authors and researchers. Twitter's place within the impact agenda is deeply problematic, coming back to this idea of harassment. As social media scholar Mark Carrigan has pointed out, the platform is different for academics like me, white and male, who are to some extent inoculated from harassment. It's a dangerous side of abuse for almost everyone else. While universities have policies regarding harassment in the workplace, the impact agenda forces scholars to delve into a social media world where harassment runs largely unchecked, where the situation is likely to grow only worse with Elon Musk's vision of an unmoderated platform. Another reason why we stick with it is a huge accessible audience that exists on the platform. Yet I believe this audience is sooner or later going to evaporate if Musk's vision of a free speech dystopia does come to pass. Twitter is awful. Many people tell me, but what's the alternative? We do need to start thinking about them. There are decentralized, not-for-profit social networks or proper anti-abuse tools such as Mastodon, but they do require more tech competence than Twitter to fully utilize, so they're not for everyone. I have a profile there, but it's not a straightforward Twitter alternative. What really interests me are alternatives that can draw on individual skill sets and retain Twitter's own benefits while working within a format better attuned to the pace of research, yet still allowing us to build communities within and beyond academia. Personally, I've become ever more interested in how podcasting, a world with a large audience and full creator control, can work for academics. I'm increasingly convinced that podcasts can help me share my research while being in control of who benefits from my sharing. I'm also interested in things like technology, editing, and so on. So it's an idea that particularly appeals to me. And different formats will work for different people. The important thing is to imagine what they might be. There's an excellent recent blog on alternatives to Twitter by Mark Carrigan, a brilliant scholar of social media. And I can provide a link to that in the chat or on Twitter. And Carrigan's own work and personal blog is really just full of insights on this exact topic. And I think, as Carrigan suggests, what we need to move to is actually disaggregating the two things that we use Twitter for: public engagement and building a research community. We perhaps just need to stop relying on this all-in-one toolkit and put in the hard work of creating those research communities elsewhere online, but also having this public engagement space as well. I had initially planned to spend only part of this contribution on the topic of Twitter, but I did feel that it was important to address something that is not recognized enough, either in ECR circles or in university management, about commercial social media's negative impact on us all personally. And I wanted in my conclusion to conclude on a related thought about the nature of engaged research. Recently, I was really struck by this question and answer session in an interview with Greg Yudin, who is a Russian sociologist who was arrested at an anti-war protest in Moscow a few months ago. And Yudin was asked by the outlet Medusa this a really important question. He was asked, "In this moment, do you feel like more of a human being or more of a scholar? Or is that the stupidest question ever?" And he answered, "No, it's not stupid at all. It's a pretty logical question to ask in a decisive historical moment. It's important to understand that these two positions coexist within every researcher and must partly coincide. You have to know what you believe in and what you're analysing for. At some point, you have to stop thinking of yourself as just a cog and find some footholds that can become the basis for a moral position. And from that point forward, your analytical capacities have to serve that position. But at the same time, you have to be able to gain some critical distance, figure out how to maintain your cold reason, and not lose self-control." I think that Uden here articulates clearly something that I think is central to how I view engaged research and public engagement. Success in this branch of academic work relies first and foremost in taking a position and relating that position through your research to a wider public. And everything begins with those two questions that you need to ask yourself. What do I believe in, and what am I doing this for? Your engagement and impact strategy will proceed from the answers you generate. It is becoming increasingly clear that where I have been doing much of my public engagement undermines the qualities Uden describes. I thought that I was sending support to colleagues and causes I cared about on Twitter, but I was only sending tweets. If you have an interest in engaged research and public engagement, then I think that we must also take an interest in building spaces where we can share our research on our own terms, compelled by our desire to share knowledge rather than the desires of those intent on buying and selling our attention. Breaking our dependence on Twitter will allow us to draw on the very qualities that make me most attached to this profession: creativity, collegiality, and the desire to make the world a little more comprehensible and even a better place to be. But for now, I have to begrudgingly recommend TCRs that you use the platform, but do so with eyes wide open. Realize the ways it is manipulating you, compelling you to share not because of a belief in fostering an online agora, but because the more you share, the more the algorithm learns about where you and everyone around you is going to spend money. So that's it for me. So stay safe, friends, and protect your right not to express yourself. Thanks.
Thanks, Morris. That was really interesting. I'm sure that will spark lots of interesting discussion. I can already see a few questions coming in. So if I just ask everyone to rejoin us, and we'll have our Q&A now. Okay. So if anyone does have a question, could you use the Q&A function rather than the chat function? Just makes it slightly easier to filter questions through there. I suppose I might kick off with a quick question just off the back of Morris's talk there. And I guess I'm just quite a specific question. I'm just wondering if you know, do funding bodies have set policies on social media? Or do any of the speakers today know the answer to that?
Caroline might be best placed to answer that. What do you know, Caroline?
Yeah, I don't know that anyone has specific, you must have X, followers, you must tweet this, you must do that. But I know that it's quite often, certain kinds of engagement are necessarily built into that. And also, we haven't really touched on it yet, but if anyone wanted to sort of publish commercially as well as that, that's become a really big factor in the sort of level of that engagement. In most, whether that's sort of PhD funding, HRC funding, British Academy funding, all of them will have a public engagement or a pathways to impact section. And there's not a suggestion that it has to be social media on a specific platform, but nearly all funding has an impact plan attached to it now.
Thank you. So that's really, really useful, selfishly for me, but I'm sure for other people too.
Susie, sorry. Yeah. I also want to apologize to everybody, especially Morris, for your fantastic presentation getting interrupted by the recording notes. That was my internet cutting out, and Susie then became the full host as opposed to the co-host, and so I'm really sorry about that.
Don't worry.
But at least the whole meeting didn't collapse, which was something that we were concerned about. The question I have is that I know lots of people are really interested in the process of getting an agent. Some people have DM'd me on the old Twitter about this. So I know two of you have agents. Would you be comfortable? I know, Caroline, you said you would be comfortable. So I'm not sure about Morris, but you've said you would be, Caroline, sharing your experience of approaching an agent and how it went and what you think.
Caroline, I can go or you can go.
Are you going ahead, yeah, and then I'll fill in what I can.
Sure. So just to kind of briefly explain what I've decided to do my PhD is a kind of unconventional route whereby I'm expanding the third chapter into a trade book, and then the other chapters I'm sending in to kind of become peer-reviewed articles. And for me, that was because one, I just felt trade was the right voice for the book. And of course, there's the questions of getting paid and audience as well. Setting out to find an agent really was about, so the first thing I did was just looking at people whose books I enjoyed and the acknowledgement section, because that's where you see them thanking their agent. And then finding those agents and thinking about who you wanted to approach. In the end, actually, it was, again, a personal connection. A friend who had an agent who said, I think my agent would be interested in your proposal. So I sent it over to him, and that's how I got my agent. But I had put a lot of research work into the more conventional route of pitching someone, but ended up not having to rely on it. So that was my process.
Yeah, so because I knew that I had a book coming out quite early in this ref cycle, I decided that I could just sort of have a go at writing something a bit different. And I wasn't sure that it was an academic book. I'm still not sure what sort of book it is. We'll work it out in about 2 years' time. But I wanted to write something different. And because I'm in an English department, the creative writing is seen as valuable as academic writing in an institutional sense. I'm really sorry, I really am coming across quite, I just want to do the things that I want to do and have people support me for them. So I started writing something randomly in lockdown about some stuff that was important to me, about different kinds of families. And it was a blend of kind of memoir and criticism. And I just started writing it. I was like, I have no idea what this is. And a friend was at an agency, but I never mentioned any of this to her, but she kept going on. They've hired this great new non-fiction agent at Mushins Entertainment, and she's great. And I was like, okay, I'll remember that, I'll put that away somewhere. So I just sent the writing off to her, and I was like, look, I don't know what this is. I don't know if it's a thing, is it not a thing? And she just got back to me and was really lovely, and we worked really well together. And it's really weird because academic writing is full of so many failures and rejections and horrible peer reviews. And your agent's job is just to be really nice to you a lot of the time. And if you ever see a book that's gone out and you're like, oh, there's a four-way auction for this book, right? And you're like, oh, look, a four-way auction. That means that probably about 20 other publishers have rejected it. So for my path to eventually get published commercially, I don't know who's rejected me. I don't know how many people have rejected me. It's a completely different world. And I know that I was able to do that because I already had something in the bag for the ref. So it mightn't be for everyone, but I was just getting a bit disillusioned with writing things that were in £135 Rutledge handbooks that no one could afford. My book retails for 85 quid, accepted no alibis. And I just thought, who am I doing this for anymore? I'm not doing it for people like my mom. I'm not doing it for the writing groups that I'm writing for. Like, who am I writing these big expensive books for? I just didn't know anymore. So I gave something a go. Like, it wasn't a grand plan, but that's just sort of the way things have turned out.
Thank you both. Yeah, I think it's really important that we have these sort of honest, open conversations about, different routes and non-traditional routes and why they might be more feasible for us and also for our audiences. So thank you for sharing those insights. There are two questions in the Q&A directed at Faria, which I think are both sort of connected. So the first one is, to get your foot in the door with the media, was there any particular internship or job specifically for academics to collaborate with media outlets? And then the second question asking if you could talk about the BBC New Generation Thinkers scheme. So if that's all right to direct that question to you. Thanks.
Yeah, sure. Thanks. And thanks to Kindiv both for the first question. I think they are connected. So I don't know if, apart from the New Generation Thinkers scheme, I'm not aware of any other kind of scheme or internship or job post that specifically targets academics looking to get into media work. What I would say is that kind of what we were told on both the kind of the training day and once having gotten into the scheme is it's quite hard or difficult to kind of make a career kind of bridging the gap, kind of being an academic who's also kind of on TV or radio, kind of channeling their own kind of programs and directing their own programs. Although it's not impossible, that is quite a tough kind of transition to make. So kind of all of the schemes that I know, the new generation thinkers scheme is probably the one that's most shaped around kind of getting academic research into the public sphere. I mean, I can talk a little bit kind of broadly about the New Generation Thinkers scheme. So I applied with, the application process itself was quite simple. It was kind of 250, when I applied, it was 250 word sections, the first being a pitch for the radio program that you would kind of pitch for. The second kind of yourself in 250 words, and the third section of the application was you reviewing a cultural kind of piece of work that is not related to your own research. And so I reviewed, at the time, kind of A Suitable Boy was coming out on the BBC, so that's what I reviewed at the time. And then kind of it's in two parts, so you kind of about 60 people were invited back at the turn of the year to kind of get a whole day's worth of media training and to kind of meet people from the BBC. And there was kind of a live debate session at the end. So it was a real kind of insight into both how the BBC works, but also the people that you'll end up working with if you do kind of get accepted onto the scheme. And then following that, we were called back for a 2-day kind of training session that was kind of much more about how to build your social media profile, how to kind of what it means to work with radio, what it means to work with media more broadly. And then kind of it's been kind of those 3 items that I kind of mentioned that are guaranteed as part of the scheme. And it's also possible to kind of pitch ideas, as I was mentioning, to kind of producers that you're working with, as well as kind of doing the set kind of bits from the scheme itself. But yeah, that's a very broad question. I'm happy to kind of take a more directed angle on it if people want me to.
We have a few more minutes and there aren't many other questions coming in. So if you would like to speak for another minute on the scheme, that would be fine. Or if you'd rather write back to the attendee in the chat, either or.
No, I can speak. I mean, I can speak, kind of say more about the scheme kind of more broadly. So I think in terms of what I would perhaps reiterate is the distinction between, and I found this kind of writing the essay, the distinction between writing for something to be read and writing for radio, kind of oral presentation, really, that really forced me to kind of rethink how I write, and kind of actually kind of was an eye-opener in terms of how rooted I'd become in kind of writing lengthy, complex sentences that kind of are there to be read, as opposed to kind of having those shorter sentences. I think working in radio, one of the most kind of the things that we were told on one of the 2 days when we were kind of called into the BBC Zoom room was that kind of radio is about cultivating that relationship between your audience and yourself, so that kind of even though you're there either at the recording studio or kind of your home, kind of by yourself, kind of, and there are lots and lots of people listening to you, the aim of radio is to cultivate that feeling in the listener that you're speaking kind of directly to them. And so there's something about kind of intimacy of radio that I think was really interesting, that I hadn't, even though I'd felt it kind of many a time before I did listen to a lot of radio, I hadn't ever kind of considered that as something, as an effect to be produced as a result of kind of how you're writing and how you're addressing your subject content and your listener as well. The other thing that I found really interesting, actually, the feedback that I got, I remember I remember saying that my first draft was quite different to my second draft of my Opium Tales essay. It struck me when I was writing it, the first draft, I thought that I was going to set it up really well and I was going to explain what I was doing and kind of give the reader, signpost for the listener where I was going with the essay. And it turned out that paragraph where I'm signposting everything and kind of telling the listener where I'm going to go and all the rest of it was one of the first paragraphs that the producer cut, because she was like, it's written too much like a lecture. No one wants to be lectured on what they are going to hear. So it has to be much more in the shape of kind of a journey and a narrative. And I found that distinction really interesting, because I think it made me shift my understanding of kind of me disseminating kind of what I know, as opposed to taking the reader kind of with me through the material, as opposed to kind of standing outside of the material and showing them kind of what the signposts are. And so I thought that distinction was really quite a steep learning curve for me as well.
Thank you so much. And I think maybe I'll broaden this question out a little bit and ask everyone just before you wrap up. I suppose for a lot of sort of PhD and maybe very early career researchers, kind of appearing on television or finding an agent or deciding to publish a trade book are sort of quite far down the journey of public engagement. And actually, I'm thinking things like the first time you try and take something that you've written academically and rework that for a public audience, even something like a thesis in 3 competition or a blog or a podcast. If you guys could have sort of one key tip or one sort of piece of advice to stand out with on making your work more accessible and how to sort of start that journey, really, that would be really useful, I think.
Should I go first, given that I've jumped in there with the unmute button? What I would say, so kind of, and this is something that I don't have an agent, but I've been kind of talking to various people. But what I would say, and I'd be interested to hear actually what Caroline and Maurice have to say about this as well, is that it's possibly easier to think about writing or doing something if you have that public audience in mind from the very beginning, as opposed to kind of doing it the other way around, where you've got something that's highly academic, very niche, kind of that interests you, it intensely interests your academic community intensely, and then flipping that for a public facing audience is much, much harder, I think, than having that audience in mind from the beginning, and kind of writing your book, your trade book, or your kind of radio essay or your TV program, whatever it is, with that audience in mind. I think that it's not something that can be tagged on at the end of an academic project, but it's much easier to have it kind of embedded within your conception of the project overall. But I'd be keen to hear what Caroline and Maurice have to say about that.
Yeah, so most of the sort of the PhD consortia funding forms at the moment have obviously space within it to articulate potential plans for public engagement. And within those, what I would recommend is almost instead of focusing on what you have to say, is, as she says, get to know your community and get to know who they are and what they want. There might be a way that, for example, with Irish studies, you might have an idea that you're going to be the most radical and you're going to expose all the radical histories, and then you meet, the nice little Irish grannies at the Irish Centre, and that isn't necessarily, the sort of thing that they're interested in. So, for example, with I have a PhD student who has Northern Consortium funding, and within her funding plan there was some engagement with the local Irish community, and she's maybe going to do some sort of like first steps into that, and that may well mean like your first engagement with a community shouldn't be you standing in front of them telling them what they should care about. So there needs to be whether that's being involved with festivals, being involved with programmers, like those sorts of things, in those first years before you work out what you have to say to them. Now, it doesn't have to be the big I am on the stage. It might also be, like getting involved in reading groups for a particular community and participating. So what I would advise is, long before you start thinking about what do I have to say, think of yourself more as a participant as much as you can beforehand.
Yeah, I think those are both excellent answers, and I can only really echo them and share my own experience. I definitely think that it's something you do need to practice, is writing for the public and working with the public, because I find if I've been spending a lot of time doing academic work, I need to transition to it. My first job after my PhD was a freelance research gig to research a podcast, which was a history of sitting down, as in like the physical activity of sitting down, from recorded history to the present day. And I had to transition from doing a PhD on 20 years to that. And you learn a lot in those kind of tasks, and you'll keep learning. And writing a book proposal is a real educational experience as well in this, because a book proposal for trade has things like target audience. You literally need to say who's going to read this book, and make an argument that there's an audience for this book. And yeah, I would just echo that. Find your audience, know who your audience is, and there are huge audiences out there. I mean, it's amazing how people are. The market is actually underserved. I find that publishing is actually quite conservative. Like if you go to the paperback section in Waterstones, it still imagines that the average person for kind of scholarly research is, a certain older age bracket, male, white, British. But actually there's just a huge audience. And I think that there's kind of a discussion there that's going on between academia saying and public academics saying, we know this audience is there, and we're still trying to convince the publishers that it's there. And I think that that's kind of an ongoing conversation that we're all taking part in. But yeah, practice, find ways to practice, and then you'll find your audience, no problem.
Thank you so much. I think that's about all we have time for. I have to wrap up there, but that was a really interesting panel, and I think quite different to a lot of other conversations that we're used to having. So thanks so much for your insights, and thanks to all the attendees. Just to remind everyone that we'll have just under half an hour break now, and we'll come back at 4 p.m. for Careers Beyond the University. So everyone needs to return to their Eventbrite and find the next link. And just finally to say thank you to Professor Ramona Ray and to the QUB Postdoctoral Development Centre and QUB Research Culture Seed Fund for all their support in making the event possible. And thanks again to all the speakers. And Alison, of course.
Thanks, everyone.
I didn't do anything. I just sat here and listened to you all being wonderful. Thanks very much, everyone, and hope to see some of you in the next session. Thanks. Bye.